Mara had learned very early in life that survival was not a feeling, it was a decision. She made that decision every single morning when she woke up before the sun, started the fire with whatever dry wood she had managed to gather the day before, and prepared the thin porridge that would have to feed 3 people, herself, her younger brother Leo, and their father, whose health had been declining slowly and quietly, the way old things do, without making a fuss. They lived in a valley settlement called Greystone, a place that had once been an ordinary mountain town with ordinary problems. But 2 winters ago, the roads were cut off by a combination of storms, economic collapse, and a long string of bad decisions made by people in faraway offices who had never once visited a place like this. Now Greystone was something different. It was a closed world, surviving on its own, held together by one man. His name was Dorian Kael. Most people in Greystone called him the Commander. The older women who had been there long enough to notice how the settlement ran called him something else behind his back, the Alpha King. Not because he wore a crown or sat on a throne, but because he was the kind of man who walked into a room and every other person instinctively straightened their spine. He was tall, serious, and precise. He had been a military commander before the collapse, and it showed in everything. The way he planned the food supply, the way he organized work teams, the way he spoke only when he had something worth saying. He was 32 years old. He had not smiled in a very long time. When word spread through Greystone that Dorian had decided to take a wife, the reaction was not surprise. It was more like a collective holding of breath. People understood why. A leader without a household was seen as temporary, as someone passing through. A leader with a family sent a message to the community. I am here. I am staying. I am building something real. He had not chosen anyone from desire. He had announced the arrangement practically. The way he announced everything. The elders of the settlement were asked to identify a woman who was calm, reasonable, capable, and not likely to cause disruption. A short list was made. Then a shorter one. Mara's name was at the top. She was the last person who expected it. She was sitting with Leo in the small medical room, watching the nurse rewrap his leg, when one of the council elders came through the door and told her with a stiff, apologetic expression that she had been selected, that the commander was prepared to offer full medical care for her brother, full food rations for her family, permanent shelter and protection, in exchange for becoming his wife. Mara said nothing for a moment. She looked at Leo, who was 14, and trying very hard to pretend he had not heard. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at the elder and said, "When?" She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not ask if she had another choice, because she already knew the answer. She said yes, and she went home. And that night she sat with her father and told him what had been arranged. Her father, a quiet man who had once been a school teacher, looked at her for a long time and then held her hand and said, "You are the strongest person I have ever known." She did not feel strong. She felt like someone who was doing what needed to be done, which is a very different thing. The wedding took place 4 days later. It was held in the main hall of the settlement, which was a large wooden building that smelled of pine and old smoke. There were no decorations. There were no flowers. Mara wore a cream-colored dress borrowed from one of the older women in the settlement. It was slightly too large for her, but clean and pressed, and she wore it with the kind of quiet dignity that made several people in the room look away, because it was almost painful to watch someone be that composed in a moment like this. Her father walked on one side of her. Leo walked on the other. And then Leo stumbled. He had been ill for weeks, and the walk from the side of the hall to the center of the room was longer than it looked, and somewhere in the middle of it, his leg buckled and he began to go down. Mara reached for him instantly, but before her hand could find him, someone else was already there. Dorian had moved from his place at the front of the room without a word, crossed the space between them in a few quick steps, and caught Leo's arm with one steady hand. He did not make a scene of it. He did not draw attention to the moment or embarrass the boy. He simply steadied him, held him until Leo had his footing again, and then gave a small nod, a nod that said, quietly, without words, "I have you, you are fine," and returned to his place. The whole thing lasted perhaps 5 seconds. No one commented on it. But Mara saw it. She stood at the back of that room, and she felt something shift inside her, quietly, the way a window opens without a sound. She looked at the man waiting for her at the front of the room, this serious, controlled, difficult man, and she thought, that was not the action of someone performing leadership. That was just a person being good. She walked the rest of the way without trembling. The vows they exchanged were short and practical. There was no music, but when it was done, and the small gathering of people applauded with the careful politeness of people who were not quite sure what they were celebrating, Dorian looked at her, really looked at her, and she held his gaze and did not look away. He would think about that look for a long time afterward. The first weeks of their shared life were polite and careful. Dorian had given her her own room in his quarters. He did not push any boundaries she had not offered. He kept the arrangement as he had described it, respectful, practical, and distant. But distance is hard to maintain when you are living in the same space. Mara quickly proved herself to be not at all what he had expected. He had expected someone quiet and compliant, someone who would stay out of his way. Instead, he found someone who had opinions and was not afraid to share them. One morning, barely a week after the wedding, she came to him with a concern about the settlement's water supply. She had noticed something the engineers had missed, a subtle contamination risk near the eastern storage tanks. She explained it to him clearly, with evidence, without apology. He fixed the problem the same day. He did not thank her out loud, but she noticed that after that, he started leaving space for her at the planning table. She began organizing the women of the settlement into a medical rotation, volunteers who could assist the nurse during busy periods, who could check on the elderly, who could be first responders in smaller emergencies. She did not ask Dorian's permission. She simply did it. When he heard about it from one of his lieutenants, he said nothing. But that evening, she found that the medical supplies in the nurse's room had been quietly restocked. Small things. He was always doing small things. An extra blanket appeared on the foot of her bed one cold night. A book she had mentioned admiring was left on the table by her morning coffee. When she sat up late reading, she would sometimes find, without any explanation, that the firewood in the hearth had been freshly added. She catalogued every one of these small acts in her mind. She told herself she was simply observing the man she had married, gathering information, building understanding. She told herself this was careful thinking, not feeling. She was not being fully honest with herself. Dorian, for his part, was going through a very similar struggle in the opposite direction. He had arranged this marriage to serve a practical purpose, and he was a man who understood practical purposes. He had not expected to find himself thinking about her in quiet moments. He had not expected to notice the way she listened when someone spoke to her, with her whole attention, not just the surface of it. He had not expected to feel proud, in a way he could not quite name, every time she did something that reminded him how quietly extraordinary she was. He had fallen in love with her at the wedding. He was certain of this, even though it embarrassed him deeply, and he had no intention of saying so. The crisis came in the deep middle of winter. A rival group from the next valley blocked the supply route with a series of barriers, cutting off access to the medicine and food reserves that Greystone depended on. The mood in the settlement dropped overnight. People were frightened. There were not enough options. Dorian decided to lead a small team out through the northern mountain pass, a harder route, but one the rival group had not anticipated. It was dangerous. The weather was already turning. His lieutenants tried to argue him out of it. He listened to them and then said, with complete calm, that the decision had been made. The night before he was to leave, he was studying maps in the main room when Mara came and set something on the table beside him. It was a different map, one she had drawn herself. She had identified an alternate path through the pass that cut 2 hours off the journey and avoided 3 natural choke points where an ambush would be easiest. She had done this without being asked. She had spent her own evenings on it, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone. He looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at her and said, "Why did you do this?" She answered, without hesitating. "Because you are necessary to this community," she said, "and I have no interest in being a widow in February." It was not the most romantic thing anyone had ever said, but the slight curve at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile that appeared for just a moment, told her it had landed exactly right. He left before sunrise. She lay awake until the sound of the team's footsteps had completely disappeared into the distance. Then she got up and started the fire and went about the day. 3 days passed. On the third evening, the gates opened. Dorian walked in with his team, all of them tired, all of them cold, but all of them whole. There was a cut above his eyebrow, already clotting. The mission had succeeded. The supplies were following on sleds behind them. The settlement came alive. People rushed forward to help unload, to cheer, to embrace. It was the most noise Greystone had made in months. Dorian walked through it all, and his eyes moved through the crowd, and they found her. Mara was standing at the edge of the gathering, still and quiet, watching him. She had not run toward the gates. She had not pushed through the crowd. But she was there, and she was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Something relieved and soft and completely unguarded, as if in this one unplanned moment she had forgotten to protect herself. He walked toward her. They did not embrace dramatically. They were not those kinds of people. He stopped in front of her, and she looked at him and said, quietly, "The cut above your eye needs to be cleaned." He said he knew. She said she would see to it. He followed her inside. That evening they sat beside the fire in silence. At some point, neither of them could have said exactly when, his hand moved across the space between them and rested over hers. She looked down at it. Then she turned her hand over and held his. They sat that way for a long time without speaking. Spring arrived late but kept its promise. The settlement stabilized. The supply route was reopened. Leo's health improved with consistent medicine. Mara's father sat outside in the weak morning sun and said it felt like the world was remembering how to breathe. One evening, when the settlement had grown quiet, Dorian told Mara the truth. He told her plainly, without exaggeration or performance, that he had not expected her, that he had spent his adult life building something careful and controlled and self-sufficient, and she had simply walked into it and made it better without asking his permission, and he had no idea what to do with that. He told her that he had been in love with her since the wedding, since before she even reached him, and that it had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He did not ask her for anything when he said this. He simply told her, because it was true, and he was tired of carrying it alone. Mara was quiet. Then she told him that she had a list in her head. Every small thing he had done, the blanket, the book, the firewood, Leo's arm in the hall, the restocked medical supplies. She had filed all of it under practical observation, under careful thinking. She had told herself she was simply being thorough, but she had memorized every item on that list, and she knew that was not thoroughness. That was something else entirely. They did not have a second ceremony. They did not need one. What they had instead was a quiet, ordinary morning some weeks later, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way, where Mara brought him coffee before he had asked for it, and he was already reading aloud from the book he had left on her table long ago, as if the story belonged to both of them, as if it always had. Outside, the valley was green again. Inside, two people who had married for survival were building, carefully and without any hurry, something they had not planned on. A life. A real one. And neither of them had to pretend anymore that it was anything less.